Oh, today's a nightmare, isn't it?
And I just hit the Zoom button, so I didn't forget.
Okay.
So it'll be not Zoom, but YouTube.
YouTube.
So we're going on now. Here we go.
Okay.
But yeah, let's talk Friday.
Okay.
Is it showing my screen? What is it doing?
Yeah, but it shows it with notes. Now, go to the next slide. Let me see. Yeah, and now it's perfect. I read all of the recommendations. We've got some good stuff.
Yeah, and it's really good when you start reading across into other things, because especially with ours, some of our stuff, anyway, it is good. We have good stuff.
The only other place I read were the power distribution.
Good. There's so many, which is really good in there.
Yeah.
So. Awesome.
I need to go read the transportation, but Jessica said things were going great, so.
Colleen.
Hey, good morning.
Hi, Gina.
Good morning. Bless you.
Yeah.
I know, I was like, who was that?
I saw everybody muted. Hey, Andronika.
Hey, I thought I was muted too.
It showed us mute. That's why I wasn't talking to you. I don't know. Anyway, hey y'all. Hey Kim.
Kim, I was so excited to see you guys working with the Georgetown Center.
Yeah, that's really great work. In fact, I was just talking with Rachel Sanderson about that right before this call. So we're really excited about that opportunity.
Maybe they'll go work with the other RPCs too.
We're not willing to give them up just yet.
Yeah.
How's it going, Z?
Going great.
Good.
I'm actually been hiking on the Appalachian Trail with my family, and got to a cabin with internet access. So
just for us?
Very privileged.
Yeah.
Better make it worth your while, it sounds like. Thanks for being here.
Just for you. There was some
You're breaking up on us. You don't have the best internet access. Dee.
what I understand is how we're get through all the great material. I'll just,
You might try hiding your or turning off your camera. We can't, yeah.
Camille and Gina, so we have enough, we have a quorum's worth of folks on now, I think, if we wanted to
Great.
get started and let everybody else kind of catch up as they make it on. And that's just, but I will leave it up to you and Camille and Gina. So however y'all want to do it.
Right. Well, do you want to start with roll call?
Yes, I would love to do that. Let's do a roll call. Okay, Gina Campo,
Here.
Camille Manning Broom,
Present.
Dr. Fallon Adu, Camille Pollan, Dr. Kevin Conrad, Archie Hall, Jason Hewitt,
And
Mark.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, okay, Mark Goodson. And Mark said he would be late today, so I do expect him. Arthur Johnson,
Here.
Kim Marisek,
Here.
Andronika Morris,
Present.
Dr. Zhu Ning, Louisette Scott. Oh, I saw Louisette. Did I see her?
Mm-mm.
Oh, no, I didn't see her. Z Smith
here.
and Chris Tyson. Here. So we've
I think
got-
that's Chris.
Here. Yes, good morning. Sorry.
Oh, good morning, Chris. Great. Thanks for being here. Awesome. So that's who we've got here, but I do have heard from a few other folks that'll be coming in a little bit later, or we have a couple summer vacations striking us already, but not very many. So I think we've got a good group.
Well, Gina, I don't know if you have anything to say. I just wanted to thank everyone. I know that many of you put a lot of effort into the recommendations, and I was really proud of the entire group and happy to see the level of content and depth that went into forming those recommendations. And I think we're going to be able to be really proud of what we produce at the end, because we know where it was written and how it was written. And so thanks for everyone for putting time aside and making this a priority.
Yep, ditto. Couldn't have done it without you all, for sure.
So now we need a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting.
I did send those out, but not till this morning. So I apologize for the late send on that.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to approve. Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Great, thank you, Kim. And now, Charles, we'll hand it over to you to lead us through the meeting.
Second.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks. And again, just to reiterate what Gina and Camille said, this committee did turn in a lot of work. Really appreciate it, and not just quantity, but also just really good stuff. So we're going to have a full meeting today, kind of working through that. So what I'll do, kind of just leaving this agenda slide up, is I'll just talk a little bit more about kind of the context of where this is in the process and kind of what happens next. And then we'll go through kind of the actions that were submitted, and some were submitted by other committees or by members of the public. So we'll kind of get a chance to kind of see all of them in one place for us here. And we'll do it kind of really fast at a broad level, just so we can kind of see all the puzzle pieces at once. And then we'll go back through the slides again in more detail and spend time on them, so you guys can kind of raise the ones that you thought were the most interesting, or just kind of have a conversation about them at a more specific level. And then we'll have a next steps, which is a single slide, don't worry. And then some time for public comment, and that'll be what we'll do today. Does anybody have any questions, or does that sound okay before I get into the slides? Great. So let me just start with kind of like what we're hoping to get out of this meeting, because you have done so much work kind of getting to this point. So what kind of happens next? So like I said, we are going to have time for the committee to discuss together the whole body of action proposals that kind of relate to our sector. And again, they came in from members of this committee, but also people who are on advisory groups that you guys might know, or members of the public or like-minded organizations in this space. But from here on out, the GOCA planning team, so that's me in our office, Harry Vorhoff, Lindsay Cooper, and then some of the folks at the Water Institute of the Gulf. So we have Colleen on today who's taking notes again. She's been on most of our meetings. We're going to be the ones that are kind of like really figuring out how to refine these actions, how to combine them where there needs to be combining, how to take a couple and turn them into a program, or just kind of figure out how to package it for the task force to kind of really see, because the task force is going to be that decision maker there. So that's going to be happening over the next couple months. And our hopes for the discussion today is that you guys can really kind of help steer us in the right direction one more time, kind of thinking again about this whole collection of actions. And so Colleen's going to be taking notes. But yeah, as we go through this today, if there are ones that are particularly interesting, please jump out. If you see any gaps, please identify those. Anything that comes to mind would be awesome for today. And then kind of to back up and kind of put this in context of our entire process, we've got this 6-step structured decision-making process. We are, our group, our sector committees are really most involved in this number 3, where we're identifying alternatives. At the same time, our advisory groups have been working to forecast consequences in that stage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of both where we are and where we're going, but also kind of what the advisory groups have been up to kind of make that clear. And then the evaluation of trade-offs, obviously, and then the decision making is going to be kind of the next couple things, and we'll be getting there sooner than I can even believe. So overall, in terms of kind of what our sector committees have been up to and the public, we have received 169 actions over the 2 months that the proposals were being accepted. And I think that's really awesome. There's clearly a lot of interest in this topic, and a lot of people that, just want to see us do really important things. And so our group alone, just kind of based on the way that we went through them and kind of assigned them out, has 34 of those actions just for us. So I think that's really a nice big chunk. And just again, to reiterate my appreciation for all the work that went into those and to get to this point. They were just really thought out. And I think it really showed, especially the ones from this group, showed how climate policy has got to engage and integrate multiple disciplines and systems to achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. And that's kind of what you guys' expertise is. And so it shouldn't be a surprise, but it really did come through in those. So I just want to thank everybody again for that. And I just wanted to point out too, for the public and for anybody else who's interested on the committee, you can still view all the other actions from all the other committees that came in. They're posted online on a spreadsheet on that website that we've been using on the governor's page that kind of show you where you can get all your other meeting information. And so feel free to kind of go through and see what else has been put forward. Shifting gears a little bit to kind of what the advisory groups have been up to. They have been working a lot over this past couple months too. They are most focused, again, like I said, on that step 4, where we're trying to forecast the consequences. And so we're doing that through 2 rounds of consequence analysis, and each one is focused at a slightly different level of detail. The high level vision, and then the second round is going to be more at the practical action level. And we've been working through the high level strategies first because we kind of started it concurrently while actions were still being developed. So we didn't really have the specifics that we have now that you guys have turned in all those templates and ideas. So they've been thinking kind of at the bigger level, at the strategy level, what might the consequences be or the outcomes be if certain strategies are put together. So what we did is we did take the strategies that came out of the earlier sector committee meetings from all the different sector committees to kind of populate these portfolios. So the portfolios had strategies that covered, every sector of the economy and all those different things. So it wasn't just one type of action or one type of approach to kind of combating greenhouse gases, but kind of different combinations of doing a lot of different things were kind of evaluated together through these through these portfolios. And then again, in the second round, when we do this again in August, it's going to have a lot more detail available to us because we're so much further along.
I have a question,
Yeah,
just for clarification. So I'm just thinking, as a group, we have, specific recommendations that we put forward, but if there are recommendations that have negative impacts on land use, communities, buildings, and housing, are those flagged for us to be able to discuss and deliberate? I'm just thinking, the installation of pipelines or other critical, other infrastructure, and the impacts on recommendations that we put forward. How is that being dealt with?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a time to do that. So what it looks like is some of that stuff has already kind of started to be flagged, and even in this course evaluation that we just did, we're going to share those results with the task force in June, so you can kind of see how that's starting to play out. But then we're going to come back together as a group one last time after the second round of evaluations, so that we can kind of get in there again one more time and kind of either tweak an action that just kind of fix those kind of problems, just like you said. I think that's our intention in September. Colleen, do you have anything else to add to that? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, no, I think you framed that well, Charles.
Okay. And then too, for everybody's awareness, both of these evaluation processes were against those 18 fundamental objectives. So all those different categories of fundamental objectives that we put forward, and a lot of those did have to do with, equity and quality of life and all those kinds of things are going to be captured there. And so those screenings are happening both times through those objectives. And so we will see those flags come up, just like you said, Camille, through that process. Does that sound okay, Camille? Does that sound like we got it, or that'll?
Yeah, thank you. I'm
Okay.
looking forward to the next, that next piece of analysis.
Great. And so, just to kind of go into so you guys can have an understanding of how that first round kind of played out. We did create 5 hypothetical portfolios full of these strategies. The first one was business as usual case, right, which is trying to understand what the consequences of inaction are, which makes sense. And the other portfolios each represented kind of an extreme version of potential paths forward that none of them were complete on purpose, and none of them were actually kind of realistic either in any sense. But we did want to kind of see kind of how these different portfolios diverged, kind of what the different consequences were, and that sort of thing. So we kind of turned the dial way up on electrification and clean renewables. We turned it up on just looking at demand reduction and consumption reduction. We took a hard leaned in on industrial carbon capture and removal and storage one, and then one that said, okay, what if we only look at natural sinks and those kinds of activities, just to kind of get a sense for how things, a first look at how some of the consequences were. And Z, I happen to see your comment here. So where does carbon intensity of materials fall into these 5? I think those kinds of ideas would be under either demand and consumption. I think, Colleen, I see you're shaking her head. I think those kinds of ideas came under that one. So reduced energy demand, consumption, and waste, where we kind of looked at building materials. Great. And again, so guys, the idea here was not so that the task force could pick one of these 5, portfolios to move forward, but just again to kind of understand the big picture implications of some of these things. Start to see those flags that Camille already started raising. Of what if the pipelines we need for one thing have negative impacts in this other category? We can start to see those now and start to kind of try to avoid them as we create the second round of portfolios. Let's see. So the second round will look a lot different. They won't be hypothetical. Our team has been already kind of started to talk about how they'll look different, but we don't have enough to say anything there now. So we will just kind of, again, though, we'll be sharing the results from this analysis on the June 8th meeting. Instructive to kind of see how this works out as we kind of get there. So I hope everybody tunes in for that. And then so the next, the last little bit I have on this is just kind of how my slides aren't going forward. There they are. It's how we get from the actions that we all turned in to kind of a final climate report at the end of this process. And so starting at the top left of this picture, we had all these proposals come in through April 30th. And again, they're all available on the website. They're unfiltered and kind of unedited on the website. So please see what came in. We did on our side of the screen organize proposals into the relevant sectors, kind of to create the list of things that we have to discuss today. And we're doing that at all our different sector committees last week and this week. There's also a few that kind of stand alone. They either apply to every committee or they apply to no committees, and I think that's good too. And we've got those two to deal with. So these, just like the evaluations of those hypothetical portfolios, we're going to report out all these actions to the task force on June 8th as well. So we're going to have a lot of that meeting is going to really we'll see the culmination of a lot of work from both our committees and the advisory groups at that meeting. And then, so if we go all the way to the right, this is where kind of on the top row, this is where the planning team is trying to take the advice that we get from you guys today and kind of organize things, combine things, split things up, fill in any gaps, or at least identify what those gaps are now so that we can, again, repopulate some portfolios for the second round of analysis later on this summer. And then as we move kind of from that second round of analysis, we're going to have the portfolios will again be evaluated against the fundamental objectives by the advisory groups. The sector committees are going to come back in September, like I said, to kind of have another chance to kind of see what those reactions were and see if there's any things we can kind of fix easily. And then it'll be kind of to the task force to kind of analyze and discuss trade-offs that we do have. Kind of even the final version will have some trade-offs, and we want to be able to talk through those and make some decisions, and then have a final report that's going to go out for public comment in the late fall for quite some time before it's finally approved by the task force. And so in terms of the calendar, this is what that kind of looks like. So here we are in late May. So there's a June 8th task force meeting. And then in July, there'll be another task force meeting where we'll see the greenhouse gas inventory update and start talking about high level priorities at the task force level. Again, the August will be the advisory groups to kind of looking at another portfolio or portfolios. Oops. And then we'll come back in September, in which case we're kind of winding down our main involvement. So like I've just promised you guys, the bulk of the work is behind you. You did an awesome job, and now it's kind of some shaping and stuff from here on out. And then there will be, like I said, some more meetings in the fall, kind of leading up to that final report. So with that, I would love to jump into, we'll see if there are any questions on the whole process before we kind of jump into our specific actions and kind of spend the rest of the day on that. Does anybody have any question about any of this process stuff or anything like that?
I have one question. On the scenario slide, the 5 scenarios, I'm assuming, so there'll be a combination of, it won't be one scenario chosen over another, it'll be a combination. And then will those combinations have different scales where it'll also greenhouse gas emissions will be attributed to them?
So I think the plan today is to not only roll out how the advisory groups kind of scored these in terms of fundamental objectives, but also to kind of show the greenhouse gas implications as well through some of the tools that are under development. That tool will get better as the greenhouse gas inventory kind of gets further along, but we've got enough stuff now to kind of show exactly that, Camille, the scale of what can be done under each of these kinds of purposefully limited approaches to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we'll see what each one can do by itself. And then I think the conclusion that we all have known and will be really more clear from that is that we have to do combinations of all these things to kind of get there. But we will we'll be showing some data behind that in June.
Okay, so do all the recommendations have to fall into one of these categories?
Oh, these categories are done. These were just
Okay.
pretend categories.
Oh, I
just to-
see.
Just to see.
So it's,
So,
okay.
yeah. We just wanted to be able to.
I was thinking, I didn't know if it was like the Princeton study with the different
Oh, yeah, yeah.
pathways, if these were, okay.
No, but it is a good question though. As we kind of create that second round of portfolio analysis, we have these actions now in front of us, and so it's really going to be more. We do need to kind of be thinking about what's the right way to build that portfolio that gets evaluated the next time, or portfolios that get evaluated the next time. And we're starting to think about that a lot already, and we just have so much more to choose from this time. I think it's gonna be really good.
Okay. Thank you. I
Yeah.
won't get you off track again.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. I don't want anybody to worry that one of these 5 things is going to be the climate plan. Does anybody else have a question? Okay, well, let's try to get into some of our stuff for a while. And so I guess, again, kind of the first thing, just to remind you, so I do want to kind of put everything on the table first, kind of this both super broadly, and then we can kind of come back through and kind of look specifically at what we said. So these categories that I'm showing here are kind of based on the original strategies that this group kind of came up with. And then I know that in some of the early work you were doing to develop actions, you kind of combined some or eliminated some. And so this is kind of I think the list that was left over. And we can worry about, let's see if we think with anything missing, we're going to ask that question at the end. So what I would do, my takeaways, first of all, just to kind of start, setting the stage for the conversation today. I just think it's just really immediately apparent as you move through the different actions that are relevant to this committee, that the ideas presented here are both important on their own, but they're also really key to an integrated and holistic climate action plan. And so I think we're really going to be the glue between so many of these different sectors as we work through this. I think it's not just because that between buildings and housing and land use that we have both the built environment and the unbuilt environment in our committee, but our work like overlaps with other committees and other aspects of climate planning. I think too, so I just want to let you know that many of the ideas here today are also being discussed in the Transportation Committee, which is something that we singled out, I think, in our very first meeting, that was going to be really important to have that overlap and connection there, and that's definitely happening. We also have a good amount of overlap as we think about the transition to renewable energy kind of going on. So a lot of these things showed up in the power discussion earlier this week. And even if we're talking about the electrification of buildings and things some things do involve public utilities and that whole sector as well. And I think that the actions that came out of this committee also kind of showed that working across different levels of government is going to be really important. And so that really kind of stuck out today. And finally, I think, and maybe even more importantly, at least from my perspective, is I think the ideas that presented from this committee really have a huge impact on not just how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but how we adapt to the climate impacts that are already here and are going to continue, and how we kind of specifically reduce the burden of those impacts on people by improving their homes or their communities or their commutes, the businesses they show up at work in. So all those things showed up in here. And so I think we're really, I just think it's really great how these actions kind of really did hit that quality of life piece, the equity piece, and the greenhouse gas emissions piece, and the adaptation piece. It all showed up in your work, and I just really noticed that and saw that, and I think it's going to make everything better going forward. So again, yeah, I'm going to walk through kind of in more detail kind of what showed up under these categories, and then we can kind of go from there.
I have another question.
Please.
Charles. Okay, the back slide. So have the names of the recommendations that were submitted to us changed in the PowerPoint?
No, you'll see the full name. So like if I showed this page, like this is what we're gonna.
Oh, so we're gonna go in that. Okay, good.
Yeah, we're gonna go to this level. We're gonna go to this level first.
There's a mistake on that first slide. and
Okay,
how
so
something.
I have no doubt. So I did these slides kind of quick.
Okay,
So
sorry.
apologize. And so something else too that came up in my last meeting that I tried to do, and you may have submitted something as as an individual, and some people may have submitted things as a representative of their organization. And I just promise I got it wrong. Whichever your intention was, the slide is going to reflect that wrong. And so I would just not attribute, affiliation or individuality with some of these. Let's just think about kind of what the idea is there. But I did want to kind of show an origin in some sense from where it came. But please don't. Or if you feel a need to speak out and say, oh, I submitted that not as my organization, but as myself, that please feel free to jump in. I did not mean to imply anything with that too. So, and I would say too, so this is just kind of the way that we're trying to walk through it. If you see anything that was completely missed as it was being transcribed from like our big list onto this category, or you think that we might've put it in a different committee entirely and you want it back in here, just raise that, please. I think that's totally fine. So kind of splitting things, looking at the buildings and housing side of the shop first. It did want to lead off with kind of the footprint of the built environment itself. And so we've got a big procurement action from Z on our group that would apply across multiple sectors, but I think really help reduce the carbon footprint of construction. And so then the other thing that came up on this page is that we also had a couple of actions related to building codes. And I think we all know how important that is. And we'll spend some time on that in a little bit. I've got some questions there. Another big category, the second slide shows a huge interest in improving energy efficiency across the built environment. And I think that it looks both at large facilities. And so we saw proposals come in specifically looking at how do you benchmark buildings against one another and, who's a leader and who's not. And also things and then thinking about public buildings as kind of its own class about how they can lead the way as we kind of move to increase efficiency and the healthiness of buildings and structures. In addition to energy efficiency, we also saw quite a few proposals that helped try to lead the built environment get them involved in the production of clean renewable energy through incentives, new models financing models to allow for community solar, trying to get more choice to consumers, whether they're communities, neighborhoods, individuals, or even industries in some sense on where and how and what types of power you have access to. Those came up, and again, these were discussed in detail at the Power Committee, but I think that interaction between communities and this world, I think, is totally game for our committee as well. To kind of switch and talk a little bit about some of the land use things that came in, I wanted to start at the very highest level where it was suggested that we needed to bring planning capacity and authority to new jurisdictions. And that came up, I know, several times during our earlier conversations. We got really good actions on those pieces. So we've got ideas about statewide planning authorities, creating model ordinances, and local planning and capacity building to kind of move all the way down through government on that piece. The next two large topics under land use have to do with smart planning and development, which I would say are more transportation related activities of the actions that came in, and then those dealing with the green space and green infrastructure. When we come back through and look in more detail on these, we can also talk about the connection between land use planning and transportation options and how to better incorporate green, how to do all this together at the same time. And I would just say too that I also put on this slide is Andronika's proposal having to do with emergency housing fund, a post-disaster emergency housing fund. And I feel like that's another version of smart planning, is kind of like how do we respond to disasters better and how do we align adaptation with mitigation. And anyway, I just wanted to highlight that one because I'm going to put it in this category and instead of somewhere else. And I think there's it's a whole topic that I think I want to talk about before we even get into more detail, is this whole idea of crossover with adaptation piece. And then the next category is about ensuring equitable siting of new and upgraded energy infrastructure, and also kind of utilizing existing buildings when possible and infrastructure when possible. A lot of these proposals, I think, applied to every sector because they either address transportation infrastructure or industrial infrastructure or facilities. And so this idea of siting is really important. So a lot of these showed up, or just there's some of these are also in this cross sector bucket. So again, we could be talking about a new nuclear plant. We could be talking about a solar farm. We could be talking about all kinds of different things. And we tried to capture that on this side. We have a small flavor of those issues right here. So that's the full list. I'll put this large category back up. And if it's okay, kind of looking at the whole list at first before we kind of go in, if we could just spend some time on this. I guess my first question, just looking back at the whole list, is, did I miss any of those big actions that you turned in? Did they get put in the wrong category, or did they not get transcribed onto this list from where they needed to be? Is my first one. And then again, and at the same time, are there any gaps now that we kind of see kind of what came in that relates to our issue? Are there things that we know that we talked about that maybe an action never got developed for, or we're wondering what happened to it? I guess if we could start there, if anybody has any thoughts on that piece.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you so much, Charles. I think you guys did a great job and the way that you categorized everything. My issue was on this slide, the last bullet. It says,
okay,
ensure equitable siting of new and upgraded energy infrastructure, and where possible, utilizing existing buildings and infrastructure. And I just wanted to point out that in the planning world, we talk about utilizing existing infrastructure as a way to direct development and reduce sprawl, therefore reducing emissions. But in the cross-sector meeting that we had with power distribution, it was discussed that it might not be equitable in expanding our energy infrastructure to put that infrastructure where it exists, because it exists near communities that have been made EJ communities by those decisions. And so I just wanted to point that discrepancy out in that last bullet. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does
Okay.
make sense. Does anybody else have a comment about kind of the overall piece, or anything that kind of jumps out as being missing? So I guess, I mean, you can still jump in at any time, but I guess one category I would just say that I almost included. Oh, Fallon, I see your hand. Thanks. Go ahead.
Sorry about that.
No, please.
Had some login issues earlier, so apologize. But I one of the things I noticed was that the bullet points around kind of benchmarking, excuse me, revolve around benchmarking energy kind of consumption at the kind of building level. And I think that that's too narrowly constraining the task at hand in terms of benchmarking, that there's energy production. Well, I think that by calling it consumption at the household level and measuring it only at that point is too narrowly constraining what we need to benchmark. So there's a lot more benchmarking that needs to take place. And I think that that may be, it's almost like a pre-category to all of these categories. There's a kind of measuring and analytics and data that is not specific to any one bullet point, but rather contributory to a number of them. So I'm not sure where that falls in all of this.
And I glanced earlier today at some of the cross-sector things, and there were a lot more data type actions that we just didn't put them in here. But I agree that it comes before, before you make a good decision, you need to know what the metrics are and what the right questions to ask are, and have the data to kind of support that. So I think that's an awesome point. Thank you for that, for sure. To kind of also add, another strategy that I almost added to here was just kind of The one, what to do, and I kind of mentioned this earlier talking about underneath us, but like, what do we do with the ones that are really specific to helping us adapt to climate impacts? And I feel like this group is kind of the most suited to that conversation. So I just wondered, if anyone has an idea of how that fundamental objective that we do have, or a couple of fundamental objectives on that issue, could be treated kind of across the whole report. So like zooming past this stage where we're kind of talking about our specific sector, but in thinking about the final report, is our actions that also, kind of have that co-benefit, should they be treated kind of differently or kind of taken aside or highlighted? Or I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts on how we kind of break that out. It shows up across a lot of our actions. And so I just wanted to see, some of y'all were on that. We did have a whole cross-sector conversation about this, but now I know not everybody here was on that. And so I just wanted to see if there were thoughts there.
Do you mean like that future development and infrastructure is climate resilient infrastructure? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I'm getting at just the way that we align the two types of policies, whether it's in updating building codes. There could be a disaster response, or just the ways that we bring in the green space to kind of and the green infrastructure. I feel like a lot of these could be pulled out into a separate category of things that also enhance our ability to adapt.
So I think what I'm taking from that is that many of the techniques to mitigate greenhouse gases are also the techniques to adapt to be climate resilient.
Yes, and so then, given that, how do we do? Is there any way we want to treat those special, in the report, or in kind of the way we message any of these things, or is it fine if it's just every time it happens in the different sector committees we just make a note of that? That's just a.
I will say I think it's important to point that out, because there are co-benefits there, and that could make them rank higher if there is a ranking. Sorry, Mark.
No, sorry, I joined late. But I do think it's important to highlight those co-benefits. It might get unwieldy, but I could almost see kind of the matrix or meatball chart where you've got like these actions that maybe have their primary benefit, but then you have a dot or a check or whatever in the boxes that show the additional co-benefits that each of these actions could provide or help provide.
Thanks. And Val, I'm gonna go to you next. But Z, do you want to try to chime in, see if your audio works?
These chats are cracking me up.
I'll try the audio. This is I know. You get to downspout dimensions, you've really hit the bottom. I think that we have been a little bit late in our proposed towards and the
Z, this is not working, Z.
Fossil fuel emissions, but it's all true that we haven't spoken specific how climate change. Okay, just go back to my text.
Yeah, let's everybody pull up the chat here, and I'll kind of read through it. So we haven't, Z's saying we haven't said as much about climate adaptation planning for buildings. And a simple example is how the building and plumbing codes, are based around current rainfall intensities rather than an increased rainfall intensity that has already been observed, and then there's more predicted. And this impacts all kinds of things as mundane as gutter and downspout dimensions. And it sounds like Z's going to try to phone in for his audio moving forward, so I'm sure he'll have a lot of other thoughts there. Fallon, do you want to talk in the meantime?
Sure. And I was actually going to just say some of the things that Z had put in the chat, but also add that those coding these different recommendations with those co-benefits can really help us tabulate towards the end how applicable different funding sources and streams are for these particular strategies. I mean, that's a huge part of obviously the decision-making matrix here. And there are entire funding streams that are not going to be explicitly about carbon footprint reduction. They're about climate change adaptation. They're about, disaster preparedness and resilience. And they may even be much more specific around retrofits to older housing stock, just to kind of bring them up to current coding. And so those are things that we're only going to be able to align once we know what those co-benefits are and we track them.
Great point. Thank you for that. Great. So let's go ahead and jump into some of these more specific, back to those kind of individual slides, and kind of start talking about some of these pieces one at a time. And I was gonna have Z lead off on his procurement piece, but until he phones in, maybe let's just start with the building codes piece. I do think that there's a lot of expertise there here, and I guess, and maybe as a slight segue from kind of the adaptation piece to the building codes piece, do the codes adequately? So if we updated the codes and we had those kind of in place, are we capturing all the opportunity that comes from kind of disaster recovery, or does there need to be is there a special piece in the building codes that kind of already pertains to that, or is it really just a trigger about the amount of remodel that's happening and when to apply a new code set to a building?
Well, the building codes that the state's been using that's different than the energy codes. I don't believe we have any energy codes that we've been using.
Right, and so some of these are just about updating the building codes. I'm just wondering if beyond, do we need special directives and programs kind of within that world to address disaster recovery? It's my actual question.
Oh, so are we talking about the residential building code? And yeah, so I mean, even from the LWI perspective, watershed initiative, I know that we've looked at this, and the codes specifically exclude recommended base flood elevation provisions and other provisions dealing with mitigating for future flooding. And so, I mean, definitely our recommendations would be to, at the very least, adopt in whole the International Residential Code and the International Building Code in whole, and not exclude those elevation requirements. And I know we're talking about, going further than that, but those are my 2 cents. I mean, at this point, we're not even up to what the general standard is in that respect.
And that was the general takeaway from these two proposals that came in, just that we need to get up to date for sure. Camille, do you have something to add in?
These proposal, he focuses on building codes for energy use, and to my knowledge, I don't think the state has anything in place for that. And so that could, and Z, I don't know if you've called in, but that could absolutely apply to all state buildings and any state dollars for things like big capital improvement for buildings too.
I've called in by audio. Can you hear?
Yeah.
Yes, much better.
Great. Sorry for the difficulties here in the mountains. Mountains, something we're short of on Louisiana. Let's do something about that. No. Let's see. So I think the huge challenge is, in a state that is not growing rapidly, merely updating the building codes and the energy codes for new construction will have a real but limited impact. And I think in Dr. Yin's version of this same proposal, he outlined that. So if we want to have impact quickly, and we want to have impact that focuses on equity, then we need impact addressing the existing building stock, whether that's residential or commercial. And so there have been some proposals around voluntary programs to make things easier. That's key. Another idea that has been proposed that is out there that you see limited implementations on different states is doing at time of property transfer, requiring kind of low-hanging fruit upgrades to buildings, because that's usually the time when the previous building owner, the building seller, has accumulated some capital gain. So to give an example, for over 30 years, one city in California, Davis, had a requirement that at the time you transfer the sale of a house, you have to upgrade the attic insulation to meet building code. It's a couple of $100, has a huge energy impact. It's easily handled, and it's most conveniently done when the building is empty at time of transfer. Likewise, they have a catastrophic impact thing where they require, because they're in seismic zones throughout the whole state, you have to strap any gas water heaters so they won't fall over in an earthquake. You have to basically secure them, because that's the chief cause of fires after an earthquake, is a snapped gas line at a place that had a pilot light. And so it's a very low cost impact for a disaster. In our analogy to that is to look at the opportunities at time of title transfer for buildings where we could look for the low-hanging fruit that would have a big impact on improving the resilience of buildings. And that could have down to something as simple as cash for caulkers, meaning weatherization efforts that improve building, how leaky buildings are, which has a big impact on how well we get through a power outage after a storm. So there are lots of examples out there, but I think what we really need to do is, I think the proposals that I submitted are pretty timid and pretty easy. But I think the more aggressive ones, if we want to have impact at scale, is to start thinking through what would it take to impact a substantial fraction of buildings that are turning over at their time of sale, as well as helping people who want to stay in their houses and stay in their buildings do cost-effective things that improve performance as well as health and resilience. So I think that that's the hard work ahead. I think all of these proposals have said they've kind of tagged where to go digging. And I think now in the next few months, we really need to dig and think through how to have impact at scale rather than simply have a few nice demonstration projects. And I'll mute now.
No, great points. Thank you for that. Go ahead, Camille.
Hey, Zia, and I don't know if this is something anyone has reviewed and researched, but the state's weatherization plan for low-income homeowners that is provided by the Louisiana Housing Corporation. Do we know the scale and efficacy of that program?
I do not.
And
I'll just add here that, so this is one of the challenges here, is that a lot of these programs have been rolled out without an evaluation plan built into the design of the policy to begin with. And so there is no budget to fund a consultant to do that work, and thus it doesn't get done unless, if it's funded with CDBG money, it goes through an audit, but that's generally the full extent of it. And I mean, there's billions of dollars of CDBG money that's been spent in the past decade on programs that have not been evaluated. And so I think that built into any one of these strategic actions has to be budgeting for evaluation. But even before that, just when there's funding for low and moderate income households involved, that the where and the who and everything else gets tracked. But when it's a program that's a voluntary participation program, we don't end up knowing much in the aggregate sense. The scale, the impact, and so, or even on the kind of contractor side, like what were the costs, labor costs versus material costs of the work that they were doing. And so I think with any of these programs, there may need to be an additional kind of voluntary registration program that's a part of it that becomes a data source for those trying to do that follow-up evaluation work. So, I mean, there's this kind of double-edged sword, is that if you don't know where the money was spent and whom and by whom. You don't know how to even conduct that evaluation. But secondly, someone has to get paid to do that work. And so that also needs to be part of that to begin with.
Fascinating. Thank you. I guess the other thought on this before and I'm going to switch to the next slide too, but can somebody that's worked to kind of update codes or change codes talk about just that process and those levers and how we can kind of, how this group or how the climate task force can best kind of try to, get something moving there? Yeah.
So I won't claim to be responsible. Good morning, everybody. It's Andronika. I had two things I want to say. So to your question, Charles, the Code Council, Jackie Dadakis with Green Coast Enterprises, who works with us in the IFA Louisiana cohort, she is on the Code Council. And we are actually working on some legislation that we're hoping that's going to get introduced in one of the special sessions to address where we are with building codes and some consolidations and things like that need to be done. So I think that there is a conversation that can get started with the Code Council around a statewide building energy code. So that's number one. And I wanted to go back to Camille's question, and Fallon did a great job of laying out the lack of a great set of metrics to measure this. But Camille, I wanted to make sure I understood your question about the Housing Corporation and their energy efficiency programs.
The federal government provides a lot of funding to the state for the WASP program.
Yeah, the weatherization program and the LAHEAP program.
Yeah. And so if we're getting dollars from the federal government to assist low-income communities and homeowners with increasing the weatherization of their homes to save resources. And so I was asking, do we know about the extent of that, if there's a low-hanging fruit of opportunity to build upon that, like couple it with solar panels in addition to the weathering strips and other things that they do.
Yeah, that was one of the things that we put in to talk about is weatherization and efficiency, because one of the issues is that the heat program is much larger, like significantly larger. And one of the things that we've been wanting to see happen is there be a shift. Because the LAHEAP program, this is the biggest program that the LHC has, and it's passed through to pay utility bills. And so using some of those funds to beef up the weatherization program, because there are some pretty problematic standards inside the LAHEAP program. They limit some of these are some of the worst kinds of racial and structural bias when it comes to dealing with poor people. You limit the number of times someone can get help, right? Well, if you know someone is living in an inefficient home, or they're severely energy cost burdened, saying they can only get help 4 times a year to pay their utility bills isn't actually helping them. So why not invest those dollars in making that home or apartment energy efficient, so you don't have to pay their utility bills ever again? And so that's shifting that way. But obviously that's going to take some nuance, because you can't just take all of the money and put it into weatherization. You've got to figure out, and again, that was one of the things that we talked about, that Harriet lifted up in setting some standards, some benchmarks, and that's what we put in our recommendation, in our action item, that we set some targets to Fallon's point, right? That instead of showing how good we are at spending the money, we spend the money and make sure that we're hitting benchmarks that then we can measure their larger impact on our ability to reduce our emissions.
And your benchmark was 5%, right, of all buildings a year, or something like that? Something pretty, That's great. This is a great transition. I was going to go to this slide, and I was also going to ask Andronika to talk about her proposal. So I think we're already on this page. So that's a good place to start. Is there anything else about your proposal, Andronika, you wanted to kind of raise up? I think you hit a lot of important points about why this is such a good space kind of to be taken action in. Or maybe what I'll do instead is say, Mark, I think you made it on. Can you kind of talk about how we're kind of thinking about the program, the statewide program, to kind of do some efficiency things too, just so we can kind of get a sense for how you were thinking about it?
Sure, and there are lots of models for this in other states, but the idea is that you have first a set of energy efficiency goals or key performance indicators that are set by the state or whomever, and then the program is really the vehicle by which you provide the coordination and resources to help meet those goals. So the ones that I've been involved in have been cross-sector, meaning targeting residential, commercial, and industrial properties in coordination with utilities, and looking for ways to both provide technical assistance, but also resources, oftentimes through grants or rebates, to incentivize both capital projects that will improve energy efficiency and behavior modification. So simple one, focus on energy. The statewide energy efficiency program in Wisconsin provides a rebate for homeowners or residential property residents, I should say, who swap out their appliances for something more energy efficient. And they even work with retailers, from local folks to big boxes, to provide like shelf talkers so that they know, oh, if I buy this refrigerator, it's eligible for a rebate. And they'll facilitate the pickup and the recycling of the old appliance to make it really easy for the homeowner to change out that appliance, and they'll provide a rebate to that homeowner once they've purchased something that's more energy efficient. When you talk about commercial industrial buildings, it can range from building automation to industrial equipment that helps improve energy consumption and efficiency. But the idea is that you set those targets or those goals, and then you build a program across one or more sectors to help you meet those goals. And it's sort of many of the states, it's sort of a pay per performance deal. So whoever is the manager of the program, gets compensated based on whether or not the program meets those key performance indicators.
I didn't pick up on that last part but that's really interesting. That's cool. That's really interesting. And it raises kind of, my next question is on all these efficiency type programs is, Camille mentioned the housing corporation, you've got utilities involved, you've got state involved. How do we feel about who should be kind of running these things? Is there a way, as we're thinking about, how to tailor this moving forward? Does this group have any thoughts on kind of advantages or disadvantages of it being housed in one place or another? Like Mark, it sounds like you've been involved in some different ones. I mean, so are there any lessons there about where it fits best?
Oftentimes, they're required by the utilities. So either the utility offers the program, like Entergy New Orleans has the Energy Smart program because they're required to have it, or I'll go back to the Focus on Energy program in Wisconsin just because it's a really good one. They're a confederacy of co-ops, so like there are 46 utility co-ops all put into a pot, and they created a nonprofit that administers the statewide program. Other states do it through, if they have a state Department of Energy or whatever it may be. But oftentimes it's mandated by the utilities, or mandated that the utilities offer those programs, and they find different ways to sort of structure it.
I would just add to that it makes it harder for the state to lead on that, given that the utilities are controlled by the PSC and separate from the state. And so I do think it's worthwhile for the state to demonstrate, and I like this, lead by example in one of the recommendations, and could have its own energy efficiency program that that it controls and focuses on, in addition to what the private utilities do.
And I think Z mentioned it in the chat. There was a program, I think, back during the last time we had a recession and a stimulus package through the state. If I'm not, maybe I'm mixing things up. But Z, did you have a thought on the HERO program? Is that what that was?
Yeah, no, I put in something in the text before about the HERO program, and I'll say I took advantage of it, which was there was up to $2,500 that an energy auditor would come audit your house, come up with a recommended set of proposals ranked by which would be the most cost effective, and then you could get up to the $2,500 to pay for both the energy audit and contribute towards the measures you implemented. And they came back afterwards and verified that it worked. So in our case, they went through our 1880 house, did a blower door test on it, said, if you do this much caulking, if you change out this AC system, you'll see this investment. And we did those things and we got that incentive. Now, obviously, it was easier for people in an economic position to write those checks to take advantage of that program. But if you think of that idea as a model, and not make it totally if you have the cash, you can participate and take advantage of the program, but rather one that that model applied to people at all income, and availability for access to capital could be on one of these rotating funds that basically the savings are some of the proposals have talked about amortized, that the savings that you accumulate help pay for and finance the program. So there's ways to make them much more equitable, but as a model that when Fallon pointed out that we need the right metrics to know that we're doing things that aren't just cool for show, but are actually having big impact, that's a model for how to do it. And it resulted in a workforce of people who knew how to do those audits. Mm-hmm. Again, it was way too small to have huge impact. It was kind of in the scale of thousands of homes, where we need tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of homes, as Andronica's numbers have indicated. So I would just say that it's the beginning of a model. Now we should rethink about implementing it again, but in a more equitable fashion.
In that model, I would add, applies across sectors. So certainly in the residential context, but it's the same sort of formula for commercial industrial buildings in terms of going in, auditing and benchmarking, providing recommendations. Those recommendations are implemented, and there's some incentive or resources to help offset the cost to implement, either on the front or the back end, depending on how it's structured.
Great. This has been great. Thanks. This has been really good. I would just also say, too, if we were thinking about just this lead by example version of it, how does the state itself, kind of in its properties or public buildings across the board, are there other benchmarks we want to throw in? Do we want to just do efficiency, or do we also want to throw in a few other, good metrics while we're at it? Do you guys have any thoughts on? If there was going to be a buildings focused state, program, what else kind of should be thought about?
I think in line with what LWI is looking to do, standards around flood mitigation would be an important way for state buildings to lead by example as well.
And to add on to that, Charles, there are a lot of opportunities with the private solar industry, who can not only go in and not, I don't know about state buildings, but I do know, on low income homes, if they've been weatherized, they can also go in and provide solar panels and maintain those solar panels for their longevity. And so maybe there's some other creative partnership, and Jason Hewitt's not on the phone, who would be able to speak to this, as well as maybe Archie, but for a larger partnership around renewables. in achieving energy efficiency.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go next on this slide. So we can kind of jump into that. Oh, I see it. Great. Alan, did you want to jump in with that?
Is Logan on the call? She was talking about maybe calling in. I don't know if you see her.
Not on today. Yeah, but we got a lot of good ideas out of Logan just a couple days ago on our power committee for sure, and then some here too. Just as we are kind of talking about the switch over to solar, and not just solar but also electrification. You know, we do want to, you know, the built environment can be really involved in this. It's not just about open fields and putting solar panels in it, obviously. So we saw things here about, you know, new models to get community solar, more choice. Let's see what my thoughts were. I guess, you know, so I guess some of these is we did talk about kind of not just kind of repeating the solar incentives from the last go round, but also kind of making sure that we're building in a storage component to that we're trying to think that's kind of can eliminate some of the unfortunate deaths we saw during the last several disasters where people were operating generators unsafely. And so there are ways that we can kind of achieve, again, multiple benefits by kind of rolling some of these things out. I don't think anybody on our call today is kind of really intimately associated with any of these proposals themselves or the specifics of them, but if kind of to Camille's point, is there any way that you guys do know of where these things can be combined with some of the efficiency things in a really efficient way, or it's okay if they stay kind of separate? We have incentives kind of on renewables and then separately for some of the other programs you were talking about. Mark, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, well, the property assessed clean energy component or PACE component is, I think, a really compelling tool for delivering energy efficiency retrofits, solar or other renewable energy generation to any kind of property owner, right? It allows them to finance it by paying, you know, an incremental amount on their property tax bill year over year, and it's a model that's been proven, you know, in plenty of other places around the country. So I think that's one way, you know, absent, you know, grant funding or some other funding source, one way to lower the barrier to entry for folks to be able to start realizing some of these improvements.
Alan, please, yeah.
I'd add that permitting is one of these things that a lot of local governmental entities have a lot of power over in terms of what the terms of those, you know, what you have to submit. And so it doesn't require legislative action. So I think it's low-hanging fruit, just in the same way that kind of property assessed clean energy is something that kind of at the parish level can be quickly adopted. You can do a lot from both a benchmarking and an incentivization at the permitting level as well. And I know that was covered in a couple of the other sector reports on the Energy Committee, but I just wanted to kind of pull that out as something that really is something our committee can drive home, that there are a number of things that don't require big state action. I guess, you know, not everything is a big government program, and a lot of things are actually things that you know, can be rolled out, adapted if it's not working. I mean, that's the other thing, right? It doesn't have to be a major initiative either. And these are things that if the ultimate recommendations that go to the task force can be clear about what requires the kind of capacity of large governmental coordination and action, and what requires more, it's kind of like the tactical urbanism, modality. Like, what is more of a tactical urbanism action, excuse me, that can be easily changed and adapted, not just as the political winds change, but also as, we learn more about what's workable in these different geographic and socioeconomic contexts across the state and what isn't.
And I am not as familiar with the pay-as-you-save and revenue decoupling for utilities. I don't know if anyone can speak to those.
Just briefly, and they're just a ways of, and they mostly affect kind of utility revenue models, and so there's really like a discussion for the power sector conversation. But the idea is that the utility helps. Makes investments in the efficiency of buildings and homes in order to kind of reduce their own need to kind of create more electricity. And so it's a way of kind of flipping the revenue models. And I just put it on this list to kind of know there's another way to kind of encourage the adoption of some of these kind of more efficient, whether it's insulation, weatherization type things, or if it's some of the renewable type actions too.
And so I'm just going to put this out, and I don't know if Chris or Andronika or anyone that deals with housing. I think the conversation that as many planners, we would want to make sure that homeowners have the benefits to increase their energy efficiency, decrease their cost, and not be passed on additional cost by utilities for any things that they do.
Yeah, if I could chime in on that and amplify what Camille was saying, was that decoupling is the idea that right now in most states the utilities have the incentive to add capacity, and they make more money by adding more capacity, and they also make more money by selling you more electricity. In one world, you could imagine somehow legislatively just saying, we're going to change things, and we don't care if they make a profit or not. But the states that have pursued decoupling have said, what if we showed a path that they could make a profit not by selling you more energy, but by selling you less? So what that means is that their rate is actually going up, if you will. In other words, what you're paying per kilowatt hour is going up. But if you use 40% less energy and pay 10% more per kilowatt hour, your bill goes down and their profit can go up. And so you can decouple their profitability from the need to just generate and ship more energy. So there have been a few utilities that have gotten in favor of this. But right now we have the Public Utilities Commission, people campaign on how low they've got Louisiana's rates, even though Louisiana's bills are above average because we're using more energy but paying less per kilowatt hour. And so the thought behind decoupling is to separate those things out. So I think it's a great model if we're going to be in a world of regulated for-profit utilities. It just seems an obvious way forward, but how we get them to get behind it is another question.
And then, Enrique, go ahead. I see you light up.
Sorry, guys. I was I'm with being on the phone is a struggle for me as well, Z. So no, I think Mark just took it. I think that was Marcus just speaking. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it is, Camille hit it dead on. We've got to make sure that these initiatives are implemented and not passed on. And again, there's a way of there's a win-win is the big overarching point. And keeping clear on those opportunities to make sure that people can, the utility companies can make a modest profit, provide the services that are necessary to community members without this being a zero-sum gain for anybody.
Thanks. And I think before we kind of leave this topic and go on the next one, I just wanted to see something that didn't come up, I don't think, in a specific action, but I know that did come up on this group, and I've heard come through other climate plans, is this idea that kind of the replacement rate or the adoption rate of certain like major, maybe like home appliances type things or furnace systems, you know, are policies that kind of encourage the replacement, you know, at that replacement rate for you know, non-gas furnaces or solar water heaters instead of other kind of water heaters, kind of things. Do those have a place in some of these, or is that a gap that we should consider kind of revisiting? I don't know. That's just something.
Yeah, and there should be something simple we could swipe from somewhere else that's done and implemented it and has success. I mean, I know in a lot of climate action plans, that's a clear item.
But the storage component though is just super critical. That needs to be coupled with those programs, especially in, you know, our current weather, locational wise, with the amount of power outages that are weather related and not weather related. There's a real that's what disincentivizes participation in these programs. So if there's not a plan for household level storage, which was not a part of a lot of those rebate programs that rolled out a decade ago, then there is a real disincentive for household participation.
Very great. I just appreciate the feedback you guys are giving is like exactly what we need to kind of keep going, doing this. This has been a great so far. So I think we're going to switch gears and kind of talk about some land use things for a little while, unless anybody else has anything final to add, kind of on the built environment, or the buildings and housing side. Okay. So I think we could maybe start at the highest level here, where we and just see maybe, Camille, if you wouldn't mind kind of talking through some of these that you kind of put forward, just kind of about why you think, just how you're both trying to assist locals, but also kind of have some statewide planning as well going on. Do you want to start off kind of talking about this?
Yeah, and for those of you that were not in our subgroup meeting when we discussed which recommendations we were going to put forward, and I'll invite Fallon and Kim to correct me if I misspeak, but we surmised that, I mean, we could have 40 recommendations on very specific land use things, but we don't have an overall governing authority to set the benchmark, to set the guidelines that helps not only the state, but also supporting the regions and supporting locals and managing land use and managing resources. And then that also obviously gets into infrastructure. And so we felt it was really important to call out the need for that, to develop that framework and that authority to guide those practices, because we can't achieve reductions in sprawl and other high carbon producing activities involving land use and infrastructure unless we have some overall governance on that. And so that was the first one. The second one, and so, you know, a lot of local decisions around land use are made at the local level. And so as the state has its own climate action plan, how can we help local communities develop their climate action plans and understand their emissions and ways in which they can reduce emissions? And so CPAC's partnered with ICLEI on this, and we are working, there is a community, one of the communities that we've done a plan in, who's putting their first local level climate action plan together. And we think there should be incentives for this to happen across locales in Louisiana to meet the goals that the state wants to see. And then, you know, with the model solar ordinance, I think this is a great opportunity And as we've discussed, and this came out of a cross-sectoral discussion with Power. And so we worked with task force member Terrence Chambers, and then also Logan Burke, and then Simon, who's with the solar industry, to develop a model solar ordinance so that we can have a robust, active educational and engagement effort across Louisiana with various partners and sectors to discuss the needs, put that ordinance together for all scales of solar. If we really want solar to be realized and actualized in Louisiana and manufactured and creating jobs, it means that it has to happen at the residential level. It has to happen at a small scale, and then also as a large utility scale. And so we would create this model ordinance with partners across the state so that local parishes themselves can have confidence and understanding instead of passing moratoriums against solar industries, which is, some case in points of what's happening now. So those are they're just, more bigger governance pieces, but without them, we can't achieve the goals to reduce carbon emissions.
Thanks, Camille. And did anybody that maybe wasn't on that small group gonna want to ask a question or kind of add something to that, or is there another way to kind of interact with local governments that we should be thinking about? Kind of how do we, kind of hit all levels on this?
I'll just add on to that question, Charles.
Yeah.
Kim, Fallon, Mark, others, and Jessica, we've got some of the transportation committee. A lot of the other local involvement could be at the transportation and built environment design piece.
Okay, great. And I guess the rest of it was so well done. We can we don't need to go into it.
I don't think there's a planner in the state that doesn't think there.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, and this is Chris. I just wanted to underscore everything Camille said. I think it's one of the most important planks in all of this is the absence of kind of comprehensive statewide framework. I think really just undermines any hope of serious enforcement or uniformity going forward. So just want to underscore that.
I appreciate that, Chris, and I do remember when you raised that the first time. I think that was you who kind of put that on the table early on. So
I've been telling a decade's worth of local government law students at LSU Law that this is one of the glaring issues in Louisiana. So happy to see this elevated.
Okay, well, thanks, y'all. Well, let's get into some of those transportation related ones. I think next, kind of the smart growth, smart planning and development side. I wonder, let's see what I had first on this one. Maybe Fallon, I wonder if you wouldn't mind, or somebody else associated with this, the action to adapt to climate impacts by changing how and where we build to increase mobility options. Wanted to kind of talk about kind of some of the elements that were in your proposal, just so we can kind of get a sense for kind of the ways that everything kind of comes together in this space. And it doesn't have to be you, somebody else. I know that had a couple folks on that one. I think on here it's listed as linking land use and transportation planning. I think that's the one that I mean. Does anybody want to just kind of talk us through that one?
Kim and Mark, feel free to hop in here too. I think there was a lot that we tried to put into this one. This is like an entire field of practice. And one of the things that we were really trying to focus on in this was knowing that a lot of the state framework thinking was being undertaken by Camille and others on their action proposal. We were trying to focus more on what local bodies can undertake and what kind of challenges that they would encounter in the process and what kind of resources are or could be available to them. And one of the things that we saw as a great opportunity is that transportation funding is a much more consistent stream of resources for land use planning, and that coupling that with the more kind of periodic actions on the part of local government, parish government, to kind of do future comprehensive planning and things of that nature could actually ensure that there's a much more annualized kind of action on the part of those entities, and that work is has that runway that transportation funding offers those land use decisions. And so when you have, once you sink millions of dollars into a new roadway project, it is really hard to then say, okay, well, actually, that's not how this region should be planned. The funding should go towards a much more compact development. And so much of our proposals within that action proposal were around, how essentially not development permitting so much as local government guiding development decision makers, from private property owners, and that's kind of people who own open space, to those that are doing kind of housing development and commercial development. And those kinds of things, and I think this is what I was trying to refer to earlier, a lot of this is guidance as opposed to kind of regulation. And that means then that there's this question of, how do you know whether you're actually achieving what it is that you're trying to achieve? And how do you even get to the benchmarks that you've set forth? And we specifically talked about coupling a lot of the tax credit programs that are drivers of capital investment. And so that's whether that's LIHTC for housing, for existing home construction and built environment, the historic tax credits, new market tax credits. We can go on and on and on, but there's so many different tax credit incentives that are major drivers of development. And we thought about ensuring that the rules at the state level for how those can be applied locally were coupled with these kind of more local plans for land use and transportation. There was a whole lot else here, so please, Kim and Mark, jump in.
Kim and Mark, do you want to add anything to that?
She captured it well.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is, kind of on that incentive-based driver for development patterns is also really linking this works, as Fallon had said, really in tandem with that statewide framework, because without kind of identifying those large swaths of property that are going to be needed for co-benefits of resilience and carbon sinks, like that piece is critical in thinking about how we look further down to the local land development patterns. And so, I think really these two ideas work in tandem.
Oh, we did. I will say one more other thing. One of the things that we were attentive to was the need for some type of carrot and stick strategy, and that the stick, of all the things I just mentioned, were much more carrots, and the stick is setting aside land and through conservation programs, and then environmental justice driven kind of regulations of land development, which there are a lot of parishes that are not growing at the rate at which they require a lot of new housing, or even a lot of new commercial development. But what they're seeing is a lot of, kind of industrial manufacturing related development. And that too can be compact. And that there's, we're not suggesting that we should kind of return to some form of kind of early 20th century exclusionary zoning, but there does need to be much more strategic thinking about siting of new industrial and manufacturing related plants and how you access them, particularly.
And guys, could just from the chat, since some of y'all were talking, as Z was asking, how do the current state incentive programs kind of promote sprawl rather than the kind of development we'd like to encourage? Can somebody kind of speak to that? I think that is good. And then Camille added too, you know, the biggest incentive is building and expanding roads. So there's this transportation.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can talk about this as Andronika. So one challenge that we have is with LIHTC. Low-income housing tax credits, that's one challenge, is that those are much more geared towards large-scale multifamily developments. And for a number of years, we've been trying to get them to do a couple of things, making sure that they are doing contextually appropriate investments in rural areas and scattered sites, but scattered sites would work both in rural areas as well as in a lot of urban communities instead of the big sprawls, right? The large-scale multifamily developments almost work in high-density urban areas where there's not a lot of land anymore, or suburban areas. It doesn't work in a good chunk of urban communities where there's a lot of scattered sites, particularly like, you know, New Orleans and other places, and it doesn't work at all in rural. So you've got, you know, and again, it's easier for the investors to do the large-scale development. That doesn't mean that it's impossible to do these kinds of things, and so that's one of the big challenges when it comes to the housing piece. And there's just not enough money, as we talked about earlier. There's not enough money in weatherization to help individuals, small property owners, small landlords, homeowners weatherize their homes. And so we've got to start shifting those funds there. And when there is a disaster, right, that we talked about, you said you wanted to talk to that. This is a huge problem that we're having, right? We see it. We saw it with Lake Charles. This is now almost an annual event where there's some kind of climate-related crisis, be it hurricane or polar vortex, that compromises where people live. It either forces an evacuation, it forces a flood, it forces burst pipes, and we were not as bad off as the folks in Texas, but we were not unscathed. And you have programs like FEMA will put up folks in hotels after a hurricane, but when there's a disaster that doesn't rise to the level of that triggers a very specific program in FEMA, like COVID, when there's another program put on the streets that does reimbursements, but not at the same way in the same level. The state needs to have dollars on hand when it's a smaller disaster, like a small tornado or something like that. They will get the dollars back eventually. What happens with a large-scale hurricane is FEMA steps in and does the hotels. With something smaller scale, the state will get its money back, but they have to front the money. And since the state of Louisiana has no investment of its own in housing dollars, they are often, well, where are we supposed to get this money from, right? There's no non-federal pass-through dollars, and you can't use federal pass-through dollars for a reimbursement program. You've got to put up your own money. And because there's no dedicated housing pot, this becomes an issue. It's one of the reasons why people always get confused why, depending on the disaster, the hotel response in particular is so scattershot. And it's directly correlated to what triggers FEMA's involvement and what level FEMA is going to get involved inside of, creating these non-congregate housing programs. If it's large enough, they will front everything, but not forever, right? But for a fixed amount of time. But if it doesn't rise to that level, they will still pay for it. The state's just going to have to front the money. And again, that makes it harder for them to do that because we just don't have any cash on hand for this. And this is one of the reasons why we talk about, prioritizing housing, because there's no cash on hand that's easily available. This is something that sometimes slips through the cracks.
Just as a one of the things that I've been talking about in the preservation circles around kind of co-benefits into other areas is that the state of housing stock in a lot of communities that have seen large-scale depopulation in the kind of past 15, 20 years is that they have more stock than they have really population to not just occupy that, but to kind of maintain it. And if there were means by which to use some of these tax credit programs in a scatter site way, they could actually be sites for evacuation as part of a localized, a regionalized, or even a statewide program for housing, for emergency housing. But the housing is not habitable, right? And so the historic tax credits, there's the federal government states the rule, decides what the rules are for federal historic tax credits. And they have this substantial investment threshold that really makes it difficult for anyone to kind of really makes it difficult for mom and pop property owners, landlords or commercial entities, commercial property owners to utilize the historic tax credit program, the federal historic tax credit program. The state historic tax credit programs, however, are within the power of the state to determine what those thresholds are and how they can be best applied at scale and at the geography for that state. And I think that our state has some work to do in clarifying the applicability of that tax credit to the geography of our state, and to the fact that we don't have as much high capital investment in our building stock, and thus the threshold needs to be lower, and that can be rubric based to ensure that the tax credit isn't used for anything and everything, but that it is used for the very things that we've been proposing in these action plans. That if you're redoing your attic insulation, and half the other things that are utility based in your property, is that not a substantial investment in the property? Does that make it, more habitable? I mean, there are other things obviously that are required to make a space habitable, but I think to my point is just that there are incentive resources out there, but there are a lot of them, as Andrenica has said, are oriented towards the large scale investor, the large scale developer, and thus there being, there's just an ineligibility issue for the many individuals that might actually be willing investors in the housing stock of like rural communities throughout the state.
I feel like we're hitting so many good things. I always hate to change the subject every time I do, but this has been really helpful. I guess just kind of quickly on some of these other kind of transportation ones that are kind of shown here. And again, we have a whole transportation committee for this, so we don't have to talk in great detail about it. But I guess my question for this group was just, does anybody have any, we see some of these proposals thinking about mode switching or just kind of or walking or biking, moving people into public transportation. Has anybody, do you have any insights on how to, how like other efforts to improve those things have been successful in the past? Like what's been missing or what should we make sure to do as we're trying to get people to change behaviors or start doing different of these activities? I'm just wondering, or kind of change their opinion on what mass transit's all about, which is, I just thought I'd just see there, rather than going through each of these proposals individually. Does anybody have a thought on some of that stuff? On just kind of how we can be successful in getting people to, ride mass transit or take the bike or anything else instead?
We have built a lot of those details into the reducing VMTs, and that will be easier to do in the metro areas, just because the tools to do that. But we also targeted some changes at the state level. And then we also added in details on how to provide more options, mobility and accessibility to people through the expand implementation of complete streets suggestion.
Yeah, I would encourage everybody to kind of read both of those, because what you can't tell from here is that they're like 2 and 4 actions inside the action that like kind of like exactly how to work through them. And it sounds like pretty much everything that everybody turned in from this group is really like comprehensive in that way. So this has been really good.
Yeah, I would just, this is Chris.
Please,
I was just going
go
to
ahead.
add, and I know it's, captured, but just, focusing on density with development. And I know this is more practical than in the urban areas, but, even in the urban areas, and obviously I'm talking about Baton Rouge, there's just still an aversion to density. And some of that's just real estate economics and the types of projects that are happening. But we still, I think, have just a plethora of low density development that with better planning and coordination, and it is, I think, more top down regulation, which I know no one likes. But until you get that, I think you're not going to have the kind of synergies of transit oriented development, which is thinking about mobility and development hand in hand, that you kind of need to get a critical mass of it, for it to make sense. So.
Thanks, Chris. And I don't want to not talk about green infrastructure and green spaces. So, Camille, do you have a thought there?
I do have a question on this.
Please.
We got a lot of great things from Dr. On our committee from Southern University.
Yeah, Dr. Ning.
Is there a way for us to incorporate her work into the recommendations? I don't know. She sent us all the work, the published papers and how to do everything with the numbers, but they didn't turn into recommendations. What happens there?
Okay, and I know her specialty is kind of urban forestry. Was it related to kind of the smart planning side, or is it really specific to kind of this second category? I guess I don't know what she sent.
I think the main thing that I took from her comments, this is Z speaking, I'm sorry, was just that the urban forest has huge impacts on air quality, health impacts in communities, as well as direct energy impacts in a state where building energy use is dominated by cooling. And that's all been demonstrated. And I think that it's sort of an unfortunate oversight that we didn't capture one of these. And so I would propose that we simply amend one of these items, that incorporating green space and green infrastructure to reflect the benefits and impacts of urban forestry into these efforts. I'm sorry, I may have stepped on someone who was half through a comment.
No, I think that's great. Mark, do you think that's where I was going to suggest to see if there's a way to fold it in to that proposal? Mark, do you want to kind of overview for kind of what's already in there and see if that's a good place to kind of add this detail?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the action was fairly broad and has a lot of overlap with a lot of what's already been discussed. But essentially, it was about incorporating green infrastructure and green space into new development through land use and development regulations, and through existing buildings or existing development through retrofit type programs with an emphasis on public access to new green space that's created. So I think urban forestry can be easily a part of that, either through case study, or through recommendations, or for regulations, or even a program to provide the resources to implement urban forestry projects for all the benefits that we've talked about.
So maybe Camille or anybody who has those papers, if they could send them in to us, we can kind of see how it fits in, or could kind of be supportive to kind of something else. Or is there a whole nother thing that we should add to it?
Yeah, I guess we could. I mean, if there's time, we could also reach back to her and say, hey, could you fold this into a recommendation? Otherwise, it's not going to be included. I don't know, but yeah, yeah, I'll send to you everything.
Great. And Z, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, we were working on a project with the developer in another state where they wanted to offset the carbon emissions of the construction of their building. And rather than just buy credits on some amorphous market, they are developing a program to do an urban forestry campaign in the parts of their home city that are not part of the urban forest network now, which it happens to, of course, be the lowest income and the minority communities. End up being, like I think I said on a previous call, if you want to find out where upper income and white people live, you just go to Google Earth and look for where the trees are. And so a way of addressing that inequity was to come up with a plan for the reforesting of those other communities, as well as setting aside money for the taking care of the forest once it's been planted. So I think that connecting things to capital projects that are happening anyway are key. So I put in the chat box, we have this program on state buildings called 1% for Art, where there's just an element of the budget that's set aside and it doesn't come out of the regular construction budget to promote art. And that's a very worthwhile standpoint. But what it does is it scales with the size of the project. And you can imagine all the money that we're pouring into building more roads, which has all their own carbon impact. But if those, everything that happens, wherever it happens, whether it's appropriate to happen at the location where they're rebuilding a road or not, that could create the fund for the regreening of our streets, which would have a big impact on air quality and health, as well as the energy use, the cooling demands, where in the poorest neighborhoods, I know in New Orleans, it's between 5 and 10 degrees hotter than in the richest neighborhoods. And that's all about the urban forest. So I think that it could have a big impact.
That's great. That's great. And as a little bit of a segue, I don't want to miss this one. I don't know if you guys are familiar with WaterWise Gulf South Policy and Advocacy Committee, but they put in one. It's in particular to New Orleans. They've been really successful in putting in a lot of projects around a bunch of neighborhoods in New Orleans, and they're just kind of really thinking about providing incentives to homeowners before any kind of regulation would come in about managing stormwater and things like that, to make sure that people are able to kind of address some of those issues, put in some of that green infrastructure, and avoid some potential future assessments or however that would be handled too. But a lot of good ideas on this topic. And so this is our last bucket of things that kind of came in, and this one's kind of a little hodgepodge. I don't think everything quite fits into that big title that we have here that is wrong again. I think on this one, Camille, I have it kind of shown up. So, but the idea here, so a lot of these things, like this whole idea of like equitable siting concerns, really does apply to so many of these different sectors that we're talking about, putting in new things or redoing the way things are. And so I guess I would just bring up sometimes it's the solar ordinance that was already raised is kind of one way to kind of help people think through certain types of developments. And I know that there have been conversations with one of these other ones does deal with landowners and in solar in another way, just kind of making sure that there's fairness there when we do it. The one on this one that I would just highlight, just because it's kind of hits directly at kind of the equitable siting, is the Gulf South for a Green New Deal did propose this Sunshine Project, they called it, which is like more of a community-centered way for making economic development decisions. And so it would be a parish level network of what they call it a people's assembly. They would exist throughout the state, and they would implement it like kind of a different, more transparency focused, more community focused level of decision making related to the siting of multiple types of infrastructure and facilities. And I think the idea would be to be able to apply that those groups would apply climate lenses, equity lenses, and health lenses kind of to all these decisions in a different way. And so I'm just highlighting that as one kind of like way of kind of approaching this. We've seen, we've been engaging with some other states recently, and I know that New York State is kind of got a special committee kind of just focused on siting and kind of to kind of expedite the things that they really need soon, and faster, but also to kind of make sure that these important community lenses are put on there as well. I don't know if anybody has anything they want to add about this Sunshine Project, or about maybe the way other states are kind of approaching this, or if somebody was involved in one of these proposals that I didn't know. But just, does this group have any thoughtful thoughts on how you can kind of manage these siting concerns differently?
I was not involved with any of these particular proposals. The kind of People's Assemblies for Economic Development, my quick browse of it reminds me of the participatory budgeting frameworks that a lot of large cities, but also now increasingly states are employing. And that I wouldn't necessarily say that that's exclusive to economic development. This is just like broadly, the use of public funds for a variety of things, and particularly when it comes to subsidies for new employers coming to the state and things like that. So there's, I would say that there's a pretty wide spread in terms of like the geography of where they're being implemented and the politics of those particular places. And so I think there's a lot to work with here. That there's definitely some model that would work here in Louisiana. I think the idea that there could be transparency and more public participation in this decision making is kind of like a no-brainer. This is just a matter of like, how do you make that, how do you do it? We have a gazillion different commissions and committees within the state. And so it's not to say that there can't be some system of that kind. But of course, the counter is always that will make the process take longer and it will become more onerous. And that's where all of the gazillions of technologies that now support development decision-making come in. And so I think that there's I've seen an aversion to the proposal, the Sunshine kind of project proposal in other states on the base, just purely off of the like, this is a change to the way in which we do things, and not a real engagement with like what is actually being proposed. And so I think if the proposal itself isn't taking up in wholesale, its parts could most definitely be incorporated into whatever kind of portfolio packages that you're putting together, because it's actually not at all that radical in what was being put forth. And certainly something that can apply to everything from siting to the distribution of kind of local funding sources for different kind of rebate programs and such. So it's more of a model for how to implement a number of things that we have here. I wouldn't make it as narrowly defined even to just economic development.
And I would say too that this participatory nature of these kinds of decisions came out across the equity advisory group. A lot of their fundamental objectives had to do with that. It came out on all those different portfolio assessments that we saw. So it is definitely keeps rising to the top for sure. And Camille, I was wondering too, kind of thinking about that statewide planning office. Can these two like ground bottom up and top down things kind of be fit together, or are they not in conflict at all, or is there?
Yeah, I think I hadn't thought about that, so definitely need to think about that more. I see what that recommendation, some of the goals it's trying to get at. and it's reminding me of the power distribution and land use cross-sector committee meeting where the focus was on that I think it's that DNR and DEQ might not have the actual practices in place to ensure that there's robust public input before any kind of industry goes in or an evaluation on equity considerations. And so I thought Monique in that meeting was going to put something together. And so maybe Charles, I'll look at this one and see how it fits in with the larger governing framework. But I think we might need to do a follow-up on that, the citing one, to be more specific to, instead of creating something entirely new, just adopting the Environmental Protection Agency's recommendations on citing and equitable citing and public transparency and discourse.
Yeah, and this, I think you're totally right, and some of those things might show it up, and we might just have it tagged as being cross-sector because it does kind of apply to everything, like Fallon was saying, and so we just had it here in case there was like a particular land use type angle that we needed to kind of like bring out, but we can definitely follow up afterwards on kind of what the rest of those look like, and see what we can bring in.
And then I also wanted to ask about the Superdome one because it's so specific and
it's really specific.
And is that something like at the end? I don't know how. Is there going to be an implementation matrix with like who's responsible, and if so, that would be something that we would just send to the Superdome and say, people want you to do this, right?
Yeah, and I think exactly. I mean, we would say, or I think another one came in from the Montreal Convention Center, and it kind of links up with I was in my head at least connecting to Z's proposal on kind of state benchmarking, and you want to compare like to like when you're trying to see what's possible, and you want to kind of know who the leaders are and things like that. So I think one, there are iconic buildings in Louisiana that we should think about, like can they kind of shine a light on the way things are changing and where we want to go. And so, yeah, I think how things that are that specific get treated in the actual report is still up for debate, but I didn't, I almost put it anyway, a couple different places, but it just ended up here because I didn't know where to put it till now. But I think, yes, there are other partners that we can engage. It could also be a lead by example kind of thing if it's again, because of its iconic nature, how do we kind of think about that as an opportunity all of its own? And then the last one, I guess, too, the one that is also kind of, I don't think the title here really explains what it is. But basically, it's not really about aviation fuel so much as using the land around airports for solar development to kind of help run operations of the airports themselves. So that is kind of a land use thing, and I didn't know maybe that idea. I know military bases have a large kind of buffer zone between them and the kind of surrounding communities, and so there are opportunities in certain kinds of developments maybe for us to think about. I just wanted to put that one there for that reason. Anybody had a way to kind of take it out of airports and make it bigger, or anyway, something like that.
So it's really using land use around airports for solar farms to.
That was my takeaway from it. Anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, that kind of takes us through to the end. Like I said, there are some things that are cross-sector, and so much of our work does kind of bleed, show the kind of the integration of different issues. But again, I just kind of really want to thank everybody for all the really thoughtful comments and kind of direction that you provided today. I think it was really helpful. And unless somebody has anything else they want to add, I'll kind of help move to the last piece. I saw Gina and Z, y'all were having a conversation in the chat. Is there anything you guys want to, or Gina, you want to kind of bring forward before we kind of move on?
I'm trying to catch up. Hold on. I'm reading what Z just sent me. We're having a little tay-to-tay here.
Which is fine. If it doesn't.
I totally agree with everything you said, Z. I'm just pointing out the obvious that, there's only so much appetite and essentially if you are going to increase impact fees to include true costs and potentially, additional requirements like green space, in addition to what they were already doing, in some areas, it would essentially amount to a moratorium. But I'm not saying that I'm against it. I'm just saying that we've looked at that in my parish, and we looked at that quite extensively and studied impact fees and the value of impact fees, et cetera. And I mean, you also have the challenge of not just what the true impact of the development, which is on the table, is, but for all, it's the last in quagmire, you're paying for all the sins of the past, right? So, so how do you spread that around in an equitable way? Because the last 20% of the development is paying for, is subsidizing everything that came before them. So just pointing out the obvious, not saying that we don't do it. It's just,
we don't do it
it's a
because
balance.
it's politically, we've made recommendations. I can't tell you in how many communities, on impact fees on new developments and new areas, and politically there's just no appetite. I mean, I haven't, even when, the shale exploration and, anyhow, that is a large conversation there, but Gina, politically there's not a large appetite for that.
And I would just pull out one more item.
I'll just
go ahead,
state the
sorry,
painfully
Zeke.
obvious on that before we move on, which is just, we talk a lot about equity, but where the new developments are tending to go is, is in, not a lot of the new developments are going to lower income communities or to improving the lot of lower income communities. They're going into, say, new upper income housing tracts and so on. And the fact that we're not having them pay their true impact is essentially a subsidy that people who are paying taxes and living in low and moderate income communities today are transferring to the wealthy people moving into those wealthy communities. And so if we're going to talk about equity, it just feels like not having people pay their true impact is a subsidy from poor and middle class people to wealthy people. And it just doesn't seem consistent with what we've been charged with as a committee to not have them find a better mechanism.
It's the same equation as sprawl.
Yeah. I'm reminded of Ronald Reagan's observation when somebody accused him of having easy answers. He said, "No, I have simple answers. I didn't say they were easy answers." So I think in this context, we might need a simple answer that's not an easy answer.
Yeah.
Thank you, though.
All right. Well, thanks everybody again for everything you've brought in today. I guess I would just remind you that we are going to meet again in September to kind of after another round of evaluation has happened. In the meantime, feel free to engage with the climate task force meetings in June and July. And we can there are a couple little follow-up things that need to happen between me and some of the chairs and some things on some of these, but I think we've got this committee turned into some really great work, and you've put in a lot of thoughts today, and I just really thank everybody for that. So I'm gonna stop my screen share and then invite the folks on the call today to see if they want to make a public comment while I get the email open and see if anybody's in the email. So let me just I'm switching you all over to allow to talk. So if you'd like to make a public comment and you're on the call on the webinar today, just unmute yourself and go ahead. So Kim, Nathan, or Nichelle, if you want to jump in, please feel free to do so.
I'm good.
If you don't, that's okay too. So let me just quickly see if we have, I do have one, let me see here. So I have two, Oh, go ahead. Does somebody gonna chime in? Kim, is that you?
I think this was Nathan. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, there you are. Hi,
Yeah,
Nathan.
I've been listening, and there's a lot of bright people on the task force, and you've all made a lot of great observations. The one small thing I was going to say, in regards to my proposal about leading by example with public buildings, I think there's a nexus there with Z's proposal about buy green. So it could be classified as energy efficiency, or it could be classified as sort of the buy green piece, because obviously we're talking about public buildings, and there's also a nexus there with the conversation y'all had about helping local governments, right? If the state should lead by example with its own fleet, but it could also do a lot to help school boards and localities around the state to follow suit.
Great. Thanks, Nathan. Does anybody else on the webinar want to make a comment, Michelle? So I have two in the email. I'll go ahead and read one. This one's from Michael Tredico. He says, facing reality is indeed sometimes hard to do. Reality for the low-lying flat areas of Louisiana is that there is no practical, sustainable way to keep them from flooding. There's also no way for taxpayers to avoid to keep repeating endless financial subsidization of people who choose to live where it floods. Only answer is for people to wise up and move to higher ground at their own expense and for the betterment of their own long-term financial security. That lesson will be emphasized with the final inundation of New Orleans and eventually when Lake Charles realizes that it cannot afford to keep itself even halfway dry despite a few more handouts from the rest of the United States before they say no more. And then we had I think General Russell Honore was tagged on that comment coming in, and he just agreed with that as well in the email. Those are the emails I've got. And so unless there are any other comments from let's see. Yeah, so Michelle says she's okay. And so Gina or Camille, I guess we're ready for a motion to adjourn. If you're.
So moved.
I'll second.
Any
All right,
opposed?
everybody.
I think no opposed. Thanks everybody again.
Hello.
Happy Wednesday.
Yeah, happy Wednesday.
Good
Bye,
seeing
all.
all of you. Bye.
Charles.
Oh. Kim, are
Thanks,
you still
y'all.
there?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one thing. Hello.
Yes, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. And I know everybody else is gone, but there were, a lot of really good insights that came out in this meeting. And like you said up front, it crosses so many of the other sector meetings. There's so much overlap. But one of the biggest things that I identified with today came from Camille. And my concern, probably like hers, is with all the federal funding streams coming in, set to come into our state, there's an overarching concern to make sure that people and entities and commerce and business and industry are allowed to make a modest profit without this being and turning into a zero-sum game for anybody or any one sector of our state. And I just wanted to echo what Camille had to say about that.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being on, for listening to this call today, and for following along with all the different things. I know you've been watching a lot of these. So thanks, Kim, and thanks everybody who was on. I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim. Bye.
For sure.